doing a book launch today for a brand new book, Retracing Inca Steps, Adventures in Andean Ethnoarchaeology. And I have two people who are joining us today, Dean Arnold, who is the author, and Dean is adjunct curator of Latin American anthropology at the Field Museum in Chicago and professor of anthropology emeritus at Wheaton College, where he taught for 39 years. A recipient of the Society for American Archaeology's Award for Excellence in Ceramic Studies, he has published numerous articles about pottery production and related subjects. His 5 books include the seminal work, Ceramic Theory and Cultural Process. Also joining us today is William P. Mitchell. He's Emeritus Professor of Anthropology and Freed Foundation Professor in the Social Sciences at Monmouth University. He has focused his research on the Andes and has published widely on Peruvian society and history. His book, Voices from the Global Margin, won the 2007 Lhasa Peru Flora Tristan Award of the Latin American Studies Association. Today, just to give you a quick idea of what we're doing, Dean will be presenting a PowerPoint presentation to us and talking a little about the book. And then Dean and Bill will be having a conversation about the book. And then I'll join to ask both of them a few questions. And then we will open it up to audience questions, and we will try to wrap this all up in about an hour. So I hope everybody is doing well and ready for this ride. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dean Arnold.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Reba. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to do this. I thank all of you for attending. This is a new experience for me, but we will. Hopefully it'll be useful for all of us. Retracing Inca Steps and Adventures in Andean Archaeology. This is a personal story about my research and my background in research, particularly done in 1967 in southern Peru. Most of the book concerns the Ayacucho Valley, and we're looking at the Ayacucho Valley from above the village of Quinoa, where I initially did my research. And Quinoa is important for a number of reasons, but I want to briefly talk about some of the history of the Ayacucho Valley and why the Ayacucho Valley is such an important area for Peruvian history and Andean prehistory. Quinoa was a spot where the Spanish placed their first settlement in Peru after Lima and Cusco in 1539. Shortly thereafter, the miserable climate, and that's almost a direct quote from the chronicles, of being cold and wet and rainy during the rainy season, they moved their settlement across the valley to what was at that time called Huamanga by the Incas, and eventually became known as the city of Ayacucho and grew into the modern city of Ayacucho. About this time, there was a separation, a competition between the conquistadors, the rebels, and those loyal to the crown. In 1541, Francisco Pizarro, who was the most well-known of the conquistadors, was assassinated. And the forces of the rebels and the forces loyal to the crown met in the Battle of Chupas, which was located approximately about here. Then later, in 1824, the valley became also important for another reason. In the Battle of Ayacucho, which finally broke the power of Spanish, broke the back of the Spanish power in South America, was done here, and was called the Pampa of Ayacucho, right above the village of Quinoa. Well, so much for the brief overview of the history of the valley. It's equally important in prehistory, because Quinoa is located just up the slope from the ancient city of Huari, which is now a ruin. Huari was the capital of a great pre-Inca empire that occupied much of southern Peru. This took place between AD 650 and AD 1050 and was ended about 1050. And after its collapse, there was a change in settlement, and many of the settlements located in the valley moved into the high mountains. And this particular site across the valley from Quinoa is a site called Ayacucho. It's a huge site. There's at the very top, there is a fortress, and along this ridge that you see here, there is a long string of houses. Around the sides of the mountain, there are stone walls, and there's even a huge spiral-shaped structure which seems to have been used for corralling, if not slaughtering and herding, of camelids, presumably dating to the period after the fall of Wari. So far, this is a personal journey of adventure, and it was probably, as I look back on it, this is probably the most adventurous thing that I've ever done in my life. Most exciting. It wasn't always easy. It's a backstory of my research. The book also talks about the challenges of fieldwork and what it's like to live as a participant observation, someone who's doing participant observation as an anthropologist in another culture, and also the challenge of changing research questions. I didn't realize at the time, but 500 years before I did my work, the Spanish found quinoa difficult and unreasonable, and they moved across the valley to Ayacucho. Unfortunately, I couldn't do that because I was studying pottery making in quinoa, and the potters weren't making pots. So I had to come up with something else. And so my research changed a couple of times, my research design. And it also discusses some of the aspects of engagement with the culture. In this case, there's a very important drinking aspect of Andean culture. Now, this is looking across the valley toward Quinoa from the mountaintop that I showed you in the previous slide. It is just below the battlefield of Ayacucho, and the potters live along just below the area of Quinoa. One of the main questions that I wanted to investigate was, does Quinoa pottery reflect the culture and history of the area? Now, that question in these days is not a significant question for archaeologists, but for archaeologists back in up until probably the 70s, the issue of cultural history was very important. And so does, for example, Quinoa pottery reflect cultural history does it reflect Wari and his empire? And many of the potters live in the area here right below the city of Quinoa. Some of them live very, very, very close to the ancient city of Wari. Does it reflect the influence of the Chancas? Was there any Chanca influence on Quinoa pottery? Did it reflect the Inca conquest, 500 years, 400 years, some 400 years after the demise and collapse of Wari? Does it reflect the exiles from Acos? One of the things that the Incas did when they conquered an area, they brought in exiles from more secure areas to pacify the newly conquered areas. In this case, the Incas brought in exiles from the town of Acos, located some 170 miles away from a village southeast of Cusco. Did it reflect the Spanish colonial period? I've already mentioned about how Quinoa was the site of the first Spanish settlement in the valley, and indeed the first Spanish settlement in Peru after Lima and Cusco. And lastly, does it reflect an independent Peru, a Peru that became independent after the Battle of Ayacucho on December the 9th, 1824. So one of the things that I wanted to do, and was urged by Professor Zeidema, who was my professor at the time, to retrace Inca steps to the town of Acos. So I started from Quinoa and traveled across from the plaza of Quinoa across the Pampas River Valley to Cusco, then to to Cusco, and then to Sangarara, Acamayo, and then finally to the village of Acos to see whether the sources of pottery making was found at Acos. So this book is a narrative about it's a narrative. It's a narrative story, but it also introduces traditional Indian culture. This is about the llamas and alpacas. In this case, the llamas are used for transport of goods over the trails of the Andes, about some of the uniquely Andean crops, in this case, quinoa. This is a woman who is harvesting grain and quinoa from the quinoa stalks. And one of the things that's happened in the last over 50 years since I was in Peru is quinoa was unknown outside of Peru. And this morning I had a granola with quinoa in it. On Sunday for Mother's Day, I had a salad with garnished with quinoa. There's quinoa infused chips. You can buy quinoa grains, and it's very common. You can probably go into any grocery store and get something with quinoa. So it's no longer just something that's uniquely Andean, but is found in many parts of the world. And one of the reasons, of course, quinoa is very, very nutritious. It has many great nutrients. Peru also has been the birthplace of the potato. It is domesticated there, and now indeed there has been hundreds of varieties that vary from place to place, not just biological varieties, but also named varieties. In this particular case, the woman is in the process of making a freeze-dried variety of the potato called chunyu, in which she tramples these potatoes, which are called bitter potatoes. They are inedible in their raw state. So she squeezes out the moisture at high altitude. The night frosts come and break the cell walls. Next morning, she squeezes them again. Eventually, all the juice drains out, and it is dried and then washed, and then dried again, and then can be stored almost indefinitely. Peru is also the place where the coca leaf was widely used. It is used, it has a value for the native Andeans as for stamina and to provide stamina and to forestall hunger. For tourists and anthropologists, it has another use. It helps you to overcome the headache and the effects of high altitude sickness. And there's other uses that I described that I use it for in the book that will help me to survive some of the illnesses that I contacted when I was there. Peruvian music, and one of the things about the Andean music is it's very unique. And although the instruments that you see here, most of them come from Spain or come from the old world, they have been forged together by the native Andeans into a variety of musical styles that vary from place to place with a unique genre. And every time that I hear this music, I am reminded of my time in Peru, not just this particular trip, but the Fulbright that I spent in Cusco in 1972 and 73. It reminds me of the staggering vistas, the azure blue skies, the mountains, the people. It's really an incredible place. The book also introduces Peruvian history, much of which I have already summarized in previous slides, and also summarizes aspects of Peruvian prehistory, some of which I've also summarized in previous slides. But it also deals with some of the history regarding Cusco itself, and this is a slide from Cusco itself, and then also their interaction and conquest of the Aucas Indians southwest of Cusco, who they then transported to the area around Quinoa. Finally, Andean environment and ecology. And you cannot understand Andean culture, Andean history, Andean Peruvian prehistory without understanding the environment and the ecology of the Andes. It is indeed a very unique place and a very exciting place. And I really enjoyed my experience there, even though it was not hard. I really enjoyed writing this book, and it has been a great experience for me. I learned a lot in trying to make sense of some of the experiences that I had. And I'm not sure I'll ever be able to go back at my age, but it was certainly a fun to write about. So now I want to briefly introduce Bill Mitchell. Bill was really made it possible. In fact, I cannot say enough about how important Bill was to this book and to my experience in Peru. When I first went to Peru and worked with Dr. Zaidema. He said, oh, he says, there's this other anthropologist in Kino, his name is Bill Mitchell. Let's go see him. Maybe you can stay with him and you can do your study of pottery making. So initially we went to Kino, visited Bill, and Bill was very gracious and very kind and very generous in saying, here, you can put your sleeping bag in a corner of he occupied the entire second floor of this house. So it was a big room. He had his own bedroom, but there's this big room. And he allowed me to put my sleeping bag and just on my air mattress. And that was my home away from home when I was in Kino. So he helped me there. And a lot of the details of his help is chronicled in the book. And I also was able to use his informant and talk with him about some of the aspects of Kino pottery. And probably most of all, Bill not only read the manuscripts, but we talked for years about our data. And Bill helped me understand a lot about quinoa. And over the years, one of the criticisms that of my work in my book was that talking about the marginality of quinoa potters, how they lived in a highly eroded environment, and how it was an area where oftentimes irrigation did not reach because it was at the end of the system, or it was an area that they could not have 2 crops a year as they did in some areas of the slope. Bill was instrumental in helping me to actually demonstrate in his book, Peasants on the Edge, that it wasn't just the ecological marginality, but this was actually worked out materially in many of the people who were potters, because they were either landless and they had insufficient land, and not only made pottery, but produced other kinds of crafts. So Bill, I can't say enough. So I'll introduce to you Bill Mitchell.
Thanks so much, Dean. Anyway, we've had a great collaboration. It's not just been one way, it's been 2 ways. And you have been fabulous in my own development. Let's talk about your book though, right? This book began, you had this idea for a book. I remember talking about it at the AAA meetings, your conceptualizing of it. I read an early draft and then another draft, and now I haven't been able to finish through this final copy. But let me tell you, it is one fabulous book. It really is great. It does 2 things, I think, that are really important. And it's great for the general reader, as well as to us guys, you know, the women and men professionals in anthropology. It shows your development as an anthropologist. There's somehow this idea, you know, here, this guy has all of these publications, and Dean has an incredible set of publications. He must have, you know, been formed like Athena out of the head of Zeus, right? But he wasn't, nor was I. We grow and we develop as professionals. So the book shows your growing understanding in very personal ways, intimate ways. And at the same time, illustrates significant ecological and cultural phenomena. So that's well integrated into your story in an extremely readable way. One of the things that Dean mentions is in the book is the drinking and food difficulties in the Andes. Hey, working in the Andes is not easy. It really is not easy. Because of the, at least in the Ayacucho area, the need to drink and you can't escape it. Because drinking is a social act, right? And you can't break the social chain. actually, just an incident with my own wife when she was in Lima in the 1980s. We were at a fiesta. And of course, there's, as Dean mentions, there's always this round, right? And the drink goes from one person to the next person, to the next person, to the next person. So my wife, Barbara, is sitting next to me. And I said, it's okay, Barbara. You know, you're sitting next to me. I'm not going to make you drink. So what she did, she took this is upscale. She took the bottles of beer and stuck them under her skirt. And which was fine. So, but after about 11 bottles of beer under her long skirt, the woman comes up, picks up her skirt and sees the 11 bottles of beer hidden under her skirt, brings her out into the middle of the crowd and forces her to drink just one glass of beer. Dean really captures that sense of these phenomena in the book, right? Let me see. Another thing that Dean demonstrates is the constant need to modify one's research design. Things are a bit different today for young anthropologists because they can, before the pandemic, they could more easily get into the field. Before, they had their field work. But that was not the case in the 1960s, right? You get into the field, you stay in the field. You're in there once, you're not there twice, right? You are in the field and begin to work right away. So our initial research designs often didn't meet what we had thought we would meet. And so one of the lovely things in the book is this discussion of your need to change what you were doing as you face the actual confrontations of field work. Field work is intensely personal. It is intensely personal, right? We speak of developing our relationships with informants in these abstract terms, but it's deeply personal. And those are some of the things that come out in this book as Dean talks about his work. One of the things, Dean, that you mentioned when you took this photo when you were on your way to Ayacucho, you took the photo. Oh, let me talk about the photos in the book. They're fabulous. They are fabulous. I love all of those photos. And the press, Utah Press, has to be congratulated on publishing so many great photos because it adds to that personal quality and intimacy of the book. And you mentioned you have a photo of where you're traveling to Ayacucho and a woman is feeding her child, right? One of the things that's interesting, that's the only time I ever had a criticism of taking a photo as well. And the interesting phenomenon is that what I have found in my experience is that urination is a public event. You can urinate in public. You just can't show your genitals, right? So it doesn't matter. But eating, even when it's in public, is intensely private. It's an intensely private, a complete reversal of US views. And that's another aspect of your book, Dean, of how you show how we enter the field with, hey, Boaz said, we can't see this, nobody can see the stream in which he, again, with that gender, he swims, or we swim, right? Today we would use, men and women swim, but we can't, right? So we come into the field with all of these cultural presuppositions that we have that are internalized, and then we have to confront the reality of a completely different conception of the world. I think, one of the things, and maybe you can comment on that, Dean, is I found interesting your past, your childhood, growing up in South Dakota, and hey, you know, your parents really created a kind of setting for you to go on all of these journeys, right? You were pretty free, and I really impressed at that. Unlike me, hey, one of the things that this book, me and Dean were, you know, I'm a Brooklyn boy, and he's the South Dakotan rural boy, and we meet together, become friends and collaborators and fellow anthropologists. But I'm really impressed how you were able, in your geological knowledge, which has so influenced my work, right? Your understanding of the geology that I did not have and that you gave to me. So, you know, maybe comment on how you were prepared for, you know, your journeys, right, by your early childhood. Want to do that, Dean?
Yeah, okay, sure. You know, it's interesting because when I went to college, I had to write an essay of why I wanted to get into my undergraduate institution. I was through Wheaton College. And I showed it to my parents, and they were shocked because they were surprised that I hadn't put in that essay all the trips. Can you hear me? Should I increase the volume?
Yes, it's fine. It's fine. I hear you.
Okay. And they were shocked that I hadn't put in more information about our trips, because my dad was a small-time entrepreneur. He was also a band director. And every year we would go to Gunnison, Colorado, to Western State College for the band camp. And he used that for his college credits to keep his certificate up so he could teach music and direct the bands in various towns around my hometown. And so that was always an excuse to make a trip. And so we traveled all over the West. Every summer was a trip. I've, you know, been everywhere, you know, just all over, just every national park, you know, been everywhere. And, you know, at the time, it didn't make any difference at all to me. I think that, so I think that had an influence on my life that was very almost subconscious, that I haven't brought to the fore until I started working on this book. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that I love to learn. And I love to learn, and I'm very, very curious. And it was that curiosity that drove me to learning about mines and minerals and geology. Now, you can put me in front of a geologist, and the geologist can ask me all kinds of questions. And I'm not going to know the lingo, probably. I haven't had a course in geology. But I learned practical geology in the field, and studying the literature, and working with minerals. Some of my work has been with the minerals that have been used in making pottery. So that's one dimension. And I think this curiosity. I was thinking about this the other day, and I realized, you know, I was in Scouts, Boy Scouts, and then also I was in the Explorer Scouts. And one of the times we went to Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico. And I wasn't that much of an athlete. I had trouble even making the hikes at that time. But one of the things that I remembered about my experience of scouting, I had a friend that became a Eagle Scout, another friend that became a Life Scout. I didn't go more higher than first class, and I didn't really care about being an Eagle Scout. But my sash on my uniform was filled with merit badges, because I just loved to learn, and that's all I was learning. And so I had all these merit badges that didn't count for being an Eagle Scout. So it's interesting that it's hard to understand that, but I think it's my background, and my parents were very, very flexible and very, very tolerant, even though I was. And I think about, I started out being a free range kid in the book. I said, I can't conceive of that today. I would never let my girls be free range kids. We've got two daughters, you know, and we've taken them actually to Latin America, and we've taken them to Europe and to Cambridge. I wouldn't think about that. And it's just such a different world today. Of course, there's a gender difference too, but it's really amazing. Back in the 40s and 50s, it was a different world. And of course, it's, rural versus urban. And that's one of the differences between us, the urban life of Brooklyn. And I don't think I've ever been to Brooklyn.
No, hey, Dean, I was the guy who introduced you to bagels and lox. Do you remember?
I guess I do sort of remember that because I have come to love bagels and lox.
When you visited us in New York. Anyway, to go back to your book, which is the important issue, I think all of that experience is reflected in your understanding of the geology. Even it ties into your ceramic work, right? That kind of work that you do, which is so impressive, right? And I think important, and has been an important aspect of your contributions to my understanding of quinoa. And the other thing is, I can't get over your incredible photos. You're such a better photographer than I ever was or am, right? And you're also, for me, your willingness to have shared that knowledge and even your photos and maps with me. And thank you.
Welcome. It's my pleasure. I'll say about the photos, I'm very particular about my photos. And I wouldn't say I'm a good photographer. I'm a good selector. I can select good photos from bad photos, and I've got a lot of bad photos. The reason you have the photos that you have in the book is because those are the best ones, and several of them have been previously published that I got permission for this book, because I have an awful lot of pictures of the Andes that are not very good. And so I selected what I thought was the best, as well as those which reflected best my experience.
Well, let me ask you guys a couple questions. I'm very curious. How do you actually prepare for a trip this way? Did you do a lot of reading about the area you were going to first? Did you read broadly, not just the cultural material, but environmental material? So you had a pretty good feel before you went?
Me, not a great deal, because there wasn't much available. I found very few. I worked very hard to get information. Remember, this is before the internet, right? Before Google Scholar, before all of these search materials that now can bring up all sorts of information. In my own research design, I had a single description of quinoa that was in a book by Henry Chopik, right, who did a survey of highland Andean communities. Out of that single picture of maybe a few pages of description, I developed a research design, submitted it, and was funded by the Foreign Area Fellowship Foundation based on that research design. How about you, Dean?
Well, at that point, I was a student of Dr. D.W. Lathrop, and so the first qualification was to take a South American archaeology course.
Ah, different.
And so I had to learn basic South American archaeology. And after that, it was during that semester that they hired Tom Zeidema, Dr. Zeidema, and that he wanted to stay in Peru for a year or two and still be on and still get paid. So they had this idea of sending students to work with him in Ayacucho. And I think I wrote a research design, but it was basically from what ideas I had from my own previous work. And I formulated several ideas. And as far as reading, I don't think I did very much. I think most of what I learned is what I've read since then. And I guess my memory and my orientation is visual. So I can take visual experiences and relate them better than to the literature after I have read it and when I'm reading it, rather than to start the other way around, because otherwise it's too abstract. And that's the same problem you face in anthropology and students, that they don't have any other cross-cultural experience. They don't have a clue what you're trying to do. It's just abstract. It's just no terms and ideas, and that's it. And that's not the way anthropology works.
Right. Well, so you're both in basically on the ground floor of ethnoarchaeology. So talk to me about, what was the discipline like at the time? What was the thinking? Did people think that this would be the contribution that it actually became?
Depending on,
Yeah, Dean.
go ahead, Bill.
No, I was just going to say, as the ethnoarchaeologist, you respond to that.
Well, I would say, depending on who you ask, they would say that Arnold is an ethnoarchaeologist. Because there was a development in the mid-1960s. George Foster, who you may recognize, who did work at Zinzutsan, or Zinzutsan, I guess it's pronounced. He did some stuff on pottery and published a few articles in American Antiquity about the use life of pots. And so there were two main, Bill Longacre of Arizona, that thread, and that became, he pretty much, in his students and that of, I can't remember off the top of my head, at the University of Calgary, really that was ethnoarchaeology in the last third of the 20th century. And so that supposed to be done by archaeologists, and was supposed to relate to things of artifacts. And my concern was not ethnoarchaeology at the time. My concern was understanding the past from the present, the broader question of how is it that the past influences the present? And my answers are, in many respects, were pretty superficial in the book, but at the same time, there was also some significant things that came out of that experience, like relating the structure of society and irrigation, the work that Bill had done, to the design on the pottery. And that was really interesting. That came about uniquely and separately. Is that ethnoarchaeology when you relate? You know, I would say yes. You're looking at the basic assumptions about the way that archaeologists think about material culture, and that's my concern. So I would say some people today would say Arnold is an ethnoarchaeologist. Other people would say Arnold is not an ethnoarchaeologist because he doesn't do archaeology. Well, I've done archaeology, but I don't like to call myself an archaeologist. I really prefer the ethnographic side of ethnoarchaeology, trying to understand the basic epistemological and interpretive issues of how archaeologists come to understand this material they study.
Whatever you call it, it's a really significant area of research, Dean.
Are you talking about the book or ethnoarchaeology?
Ethnoarchaeology, what you do, right? The kind of work you do is truly significant, right? Whatever name may be applied to it, I would call it ethnoarchaeology, a different kind. But I think maybe, you know, I have a predilection for broad interpretations of things rather than narrow ones. I like to include rather than to exclude.
Well, what I've done has really been different. And I mean, I'm not saying that everybody else should do what I do, and I'm not criticizing Longacre and get the name of the other guy from Africa who's at the University of Calgary, who's done wonderful work. It's fantastic, and our students have made great significance, but that's not what I do. And call that archaeology and call me, but I do something else, that's fine. I like what I do, and it's really kind of an independent, a very different approach to the past, a very different approach to understanding how we understand the past.
Well, let me ask both of you, what did you find to be your favorite part of field work? Just generally.
You want to go first, Dean, or do you want me?
You go ahead. If you have an answer, go ahead.
I do. You know, one of the things that I found once in the 1970s, I was on top of a truck I was working in Quinoa, and I was there with my then wife and my young son, who was 1.5, who is now an anthropologist, by the way. I was on top. I was traveling back and forth from Ayacucho to Quinoa because he had become extremely sick, right? Extremely sick. It's not the best field work conditions, but I had a great deal of rapport in the community, and I was able to pull it off. But on top of this truck, and waiting for the truck to come out, as Dean portrays in the book, of how we would hop onto trucks and in order to get into. So I get on top of this load of coca leaves, right, late at night, and of course I'm at the control, and I'm offered something to drink, right? So I can't say no. I say yes. I try to limit it. I used to spill out the liquor onto my sweatshirt as I drank it, so I wouldn't drink so much. But I'm on the top of this truck, and we're heading back into Ayacucho. It was nightfall, and I looked at that stunning sky. That stunning sky. It was so beautiful. And I said to myself, I'm the luckiest person in the world. I am the luckiest person in the world. And there were shooting stars shooting over the sky. Maybe you were able to see such a sky, Dean, in South Dakota, but coming from Brooklyn, I never did, right? I never did. And that kind of physical beauty, right? The physical beauty of there. And the other thing that's tied to that was the intimacy that I developed with so many people and the trust that people had in me. Women would talk to me about the way their husbands abused them, right? If I were to reveal that kind of thing, I mean, they trusted me, this kind of intimate trust. That kind of human intimacy, connecting with other people with different cultural systems tied to the physical beauty. I'm among the lucky peoples of the world. That's how I feel.
I would say that about the beauty of the Andes too. The night sky. I remember that when I actually led a tour to Peru. This was 1978 or 79, and the bus broke down in the bottom of the valley near Pacaycasa, below Huari, and so I had to keep these people entertained because they were tourists. Paid a lot of money for this trip. The bus broke down. The driver had hitchhiked to Ayacucho to try to get another bus. So we're there. So we looked up at the sky, and so I started talking about the sky. It was just absolutely stunning. Had an experience like that in Ecuador, Highland, Ecuador. Just the light from the stars even without the moon was breathtaking. I think that even more important than that, and I think back to my experience in Yucatan, even more so than my experience in Peru, was the relationships with the people who I just loved. And I loved the food in Yucatan. I love the food of Peru too. It's fabulous. Some of those dishes like papas a la huancaína and lomo saltado and all those wonderful dishes that ceviche. Oh dear, I wish they have Peruvian restaurants around here, but I'm sorry, it just isn't the same.
Well, I see we've been talking for a while now. Hannah, are there any questions the audience wants to ask?
No, I don't have any right now, but I'd like to thank you both. It was a very interesting conversation.
Well, let me ask a couple more. We'll let everybody, if anybody has any questions, feel free to enter them in chat. Chat function is at the bottom of your screen. and you can enter your questions there. And Hannah, if you see any come in, please feel free to ask, and I'll just ask another question while we see if there's any others. So when you came back from the field, both of you, you were completely enlightened by this trip, I'm sure, as to your shortcomings, your strengths. How did it impact your actual research from there on out and your kind of outlook about your research?
Dean, do you want to go first, or? I can go.
Please go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, again, when I relate to that, that we're supposed to be Athena, coming full formed from the head of Zeus. I certainly wasn't, right? I found that my initial research was simply the preparation for later research. I actually published an article in the Journal of Anthropological Research last year in January, explaining and exploring these developments of me as an anthropologist. So that first research trip for me was simply, and actually that ties to Malinowski, our famous predecessor in his introduction to Argonauts of the Western Pacific, in which he discusses methodology, and which he emphasizes that your first trip is you go and you find out what you then need to learn and go back and then learn it, right? Which is what happened to me. So going over my data and actually being aided by Dean and his understanding of the geology, et cetera, I began to research later in 1973 and 1974 and in 1980 and so on, many research trips later, I kept finding new things to discover and explore I would say, I'm glad my dissertation wasn't published, right? Because it was just a preparation for my unfolding and understanding as an anthropologist. How about you, Dean?
Well, it's hard to say because I came back, then in my girlfriend at the time, I had become very serious about, and I was pretty preoccupied between 1967 and 68. We got married in 68. Then I went off to Yucatan, and then I wrote my dissertation. Then I got involved in research in Mexico and Guatemala. So it's really hard to separate out how this affected me at the time. I will say that one of the things about all field work, if you get involved with the people and you see their lives, and for example, one of my friends in Mexico, I mean, he had his wife, he had his sixth child, she had a major surgery. It must have been a cesarean, and it cost him a bundle because he had no health insurance. He had to sell his land, and that made a deep impression on me. How many people without health, without insurance, and the privileges that we have in this country, and how there's so many people in the world who don't have what we have, and how they have to suffer because of it. And then the understanding I said this in the book too, that the understanding the hopelessness that these people have, being at the bottom of the social rung, not being able to speak or write Spanish, being denied or not being able to go to school and to be able to improve themselves. And then recognizing having them see that really radical revolution is the only way. And one of the exciting things that I see happening today, of course, things are changing. And I don't know Peru, but I know that's when I went back and was there in 72 and 73, I was teaching at the university, and there were people from the rural areas that were actually going to school and getting university degrees. So things are changing and changing a lot. But I think it gave me a tremendous empathy and understanding of the underclass of people that didn't have what I had. And also a recognition that your own perspective, your own ethnocentrism really does color you in ways you don't understand. Bill did a wonderful job of pointing this out to me in some of the earlier drafts of my book. And he said, Dean, he said, you can't say this. He says, that's ethnocentric. I said, really? I said, oh yeah, you're right. It is. I never thought it colors, even though you may be a professional anthropologist and teach stuff, you still have these residual cultural categories that affect the way you see the world.
Boaz, we can't see the water in which we swim.
Yeah. I would like to briefly make a
Well,
call.
let me,
Can I make a brief call out to Emily? And Emily, I
sure, absolutely.
would love to be in contact with you. Could you email me using my Field Museum address? I don't know where you are, if you're in Peru or you're in the US, but please do so. I'd like to send you a copy of the book. Because Emily was one of the ones who was one of the readers. I assume it's the Emily I know. I'm in Lima. Oh, okay. Thank you. If you have a Field Museum address, I would love to be in contact with you. So anyway, I wanted to make that call out to her because she'd read the book and she was very helpful. And I wanted a native Peruvian to read it in case I didn't want to step on any toes. And
You're fine.
she liked it.
Well, let me ask you one last question. What would be your real takeaway for graduate students, both of you, based on this work and these publications that you've done? What would you tell people today?
About
Getting ready and going to do field work and undertaking this kind of a project?
Field work is very different. As I mentioned, my son is an anthropologist, but before he began his field work, he was in Brazil, learning the language in Brazil, obtaining the knowledge. Remember, when we were students, I flew to Peru in a propeller plane, right? I flew over the Andes in a plane that wasn't pressurized. We had to use oxygen as we flew over the continental divide. So it's much more difficult to travel back and forth. So, for me, as much prior preparation as possible, but always to be open to, hey, your perceived conceptions are going to change when you're faced with the reality of wherever you are. What do you think, Dean?
Well, what I was going to say initially is don't be afraid of failure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Failure is a matter of perception. And, the phrase of weaving a silk purse from a sow's ear is apt, because what may seem to be failure is mainly your expectations of yourself. And that if you're creative enough and innovative enough, you can obtain material, as I did, from changing your research design. And so that's one aspect I would say. I think the second thing that I would say is something that should be true of every person that goes abroad, not just anthropologists. Adaptability and flexibility is very important. And sometimes you don't know that until you actually get to the field. I was under the impression, whether falsely or genuinely, at the university of which I was a graduate student, which I will not name, which is easily enough to find out, used fieldwork to weed out people who wanted to be anthropologists. And because there are a number of people that came back that just said they just couldn't do it.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, well, maybe they're doing this deliberately, sending them to the field, give them a small grant, go to the field and see if they can cut it. And so adaptability, flexibility is very, very important. And with creativity and hard work and persistence, perseverance, so all those are important. They're probably important in any discipline, but particularly in anthropology. And
I would like to add and tie it to your book. Is the other thing is when you do a manuscript, write a manuscript, right? It's going to be very rough at the beginning, right? Well, that's great. You have something down, then you revise it and you go over it and change it. And then you get something as wonderful as the book you have, Dean.
And I would add, to, don't be afraid of rejection. My work
Right,
is
that's the other thing, yeah.
rejected by some of the finest book publishers and journals in the world.
Yeah.
I stuck at it. And sometimes the work was just inappropriate to where I sent it. But stick with it and then build on the criticisms of the people that the peer reviews. And so, yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both for a lovely conversation. It's a wonderful book. It's very readable. I learned a lot from the whole project. And I appreciate your time today. Hannah, thanks for being here and helping us out. The director for the press, Glenda Cotter, is also here. Thanks, Glenda. And it's been a wonderful conversation. It's been really fun to talk to you both. So we appreciate your time and we wish you all a great day. And thanks for coming to this virtual book launch, and check out Dean Arnold's book. Wonderful book. Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you all who came, and thank you to Hannah and Reba. Appreciate it very much. And Bill, too.